right. Good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to The List. I'm Henrietta Holdish. I'm the curator who organized this exhibition. I'm really thrilled to see this many people come out to the performance. I'm equally thrilled to welcome David Grubbs and Eli Keszler to Cambridge and to The List. Here they are. They will in a moment perform a new piece that is called One and One Less, which opens our exhibition series, Open Tunings. And it is actually only the second time they've played together.
Now that the audience is assembled for the musician's brooded first contact with an instrument we can't yet visualize and cannot imagine what it could be made to sound like. Which instrument is that? What's it called? The figure slowly makes as if to remove an instrument from a case whose contours remain obscure. For all we know, the instrument's case has always been leaning in the corner of this darkened, already stage-lit room. Always behind the door that just closed itself, or was closed by a swift, unnoticed hand. There was a door ajar, upstage left, and then it was closed and the room sealed. When's our start time? The instrument waits in a case that's free from the first sign of wear. For all we can see, it looks as if it's never left this room. The room itself appears newly painted, a black and gray blue, a color that absorbs sound, and strangely, free of dust. It looks as if it's never left, never been anywhere but behind the door. The audience conducts last-minute stretching exercises in their seats. What's inside the case? The instrument waits unseen. Regarding its design and execution, it would be inadvisable to say. Instant nightfall within the covered cage. Nor is it possible to hazard whether the instrument is in tune, whether it will function as it should, or even the extent to which it can be made to cooperate. How should it function? Not now. What's the occasion to rise, as if there had been no waiting at all, a hush? A wave rushing the length of the room silences exchanges, catchings up. Now time's upon us. Do you recognize the figure? The gangly silhouette crossing the stage area. The lighted rectangle without chairs, without audience members, flush against a gently concave portion of wall, might be this evening's instrument wrangler, a stagehand, a tech person, qualified to decide whether what's in the case, formerly behind door number 1, is ready to function as an instrument, is ready to rodeo. There are degrees of cooperation, and we've all seen instruments that refuse to cooperate and are no less the instrument for it, are ready or not to play nice. Perhaps they're less desirable from the perspective of the performer, or less desirable from the vantage of the audience, but there will be no angry tearing off the stripes, no shaming, no expulsion from tonight's event. The tickets have been time-stamped, everyone clocked in, the audience is upon us, times. Gathered. Stepping fully out of shadow, the figure is suddenly recognizable as tonight's performer, a musician inclined, for lack of a better term, to improvising, accepting, making do, jerry-rigging, thinking on her feet, famously hashing it out in public. Real-time instrument invention, construction, demolition, repair, referral, solo repurposing, duo repurposing, trio and large ensemble, not to give it away, but tonight solo, and in momentous first contact with, this may be one contact with, the waiting instrument. Time's bunched. When does the performance begin? How could it be made to sound? Unrecognizable instrument, waiting dustless, laid bare in the musician's X-ray gaze, that super-sensory sometime dividing line between performer and audience, upstage left where there had been a door, and where now there's just door erased and sketched in blue-gray blackened space. Space of audience and performer, solo performer, real-time and shared-time instrument builder, and of the brightly lit rectangle of stage abutting a listless, stretching audience. Every seat is taken, every spectator is upon us. If the instrument is unrecognizable, then how should it be assembled? Downbeat and gambit. What sounds occur in the process of assembling the audience, or rather the instrument, we can't picture and can't picture sounding? What's shared time? Picture breath striking solid, darkened and absorbing gelled contour. Picture breath and mineral, brilliantly polished mineral, breath polished mineral. Picture breath and unbreakable retrofuturist compound. Picture breath unopposed, breath unceasing, breath and flesh, and the audience softly inhales. With breaths traversing aperture, with breath funneled through aperture, with breath so vigorously tunneling. The audience exhales, all those sated lungs. The audience breathes. In. Yes. A bit closer to unison, and we still have time, shard time, to act as one. It will be done. Picture the instrument in no one's memory. Picture the instrument yet to be summoned. Picture the instrument the musician hasn't in fact held or beheld, the instrument the musician's far from assembling. Picture breath striking solid, breath stopped short, with breath artfully diverted, with breath whistling across aperture in the dark, fearfully. A longer rest, a slower rest, a merciless combining of shorter rests, a downshift and a density change. The musician breathes in and the audience breathes out, all those who sit and lunge. A mid-air meeting and the faintest promise of aerial skirmishes, many small tornadoes. The musician exhales with breath-striking chord, with breath-exciting chord, with breath zinging the length of fleshy chord, with breath exciting. Increasingly shorter divisions, to sing, with breath to sing these progressively smaller lengths of chord, doing their damnedest, voice print and thumbprint, to color, to jab, and to smear, and thus to cast one's lot and one's ballot, and to find and satisfyingly hold a pitch, a purple thumb displayed aloft. Present and finally accounted for upon the memory surface of audience, breath and sounding body, now without stopping, now without separating one gesture from a next, held and ongoing, and so the unheard next, without repeating, without recognizing repetition as such, without believing repetition. Now it's the audience's turn. It exhales still more convincingly with a single breath. The musician inhales, bends her steps upstage left toward the door erased. Expand as proceeding fill. Audio feedback is the consequence of an audience's intensity of focus. That's how it's made. From time to time, a musician might fool an instrument and an amplifier into thinking that he or she represents the will of the audience, acts as delegate. The musician breathes in and feeds back and stands in for audience, sounding the deciding vote in the form of, think Bartleby's flute-like feedback. This time upon us all with eyes on the lighted rectangle, a wave and a hush, and here we are again, waiting, with breath held and with breath voided, with breath surrendered, Bartleby's stilled voice now reanimated. The audience can only guess which hologram is up next. We'll rock the bells with breath reclaimed. With an unsteady lunge, with holographic swagger and flicker, but equipped, it should be said, with a satisfyingly husky stripe of feedback to sing, delivered at the volume of a reassuringly gentle speaking voice, or to some so reassuring a voice as to trouble, with breath and body sundered, without looking and without stopping, a malfunctioning voice. It's unclear. A vowel, an O captured and stretched like so, a human O, rendered in the medium of red laser pointer. A dogged worrying of a modest patch of ground, the quietest feedback, scaled to the volume, a flute-like voice. What's next might remain unheard. Feedback swims above ground. It swims about our heads. Feedback seeks to exhaust itself, fails, failing. It's a nervous footprinting, a restless shifting of weight from one foot to paw to hoof. Initially catches tail, so give it back. Share alike this unamplified O, our holograms, flute-like feedback, one unending vowel and another utterance less. Feedback sustains, possesses only an interior, audience and musician and speaker and listener alike enclosed no matter how quiet the counting down. A rip curl encloses, a ribbed sphere, a magnetically charged interior. Feedback, no matter the scale, impresses not as object but as location, even this O. Smaller and quieter, unprepossessing feedback. In Bartleby's efficient waveform, the sine wave can always be counted on to thread the needle, deathlessly penetrate the immobilized eye. How can the audience inhabit so quiet a sound? Indifferent feedback, where there had been a door, sound to envelop a lighted rectangle, and much more. The red laser touches retina, radically expands. So quiet inside this O, and so upon us it truly seizes breath. It holds breath. Without separating one gesture from another, without repeating, without recognizing repetition as such, without believing, and without really to anyone's satisfaction describing, then it clicks off. Red aural after image. With breath held, I can have you expelled. N counterpoint of 2. Opposing breaths. In the absence of feedback, however small, however quiet it had been, the audience resumes the involuntary exercise of breathing as one. One breath for now, after the next, a hush and a wave, a sequence, a series, an O, no longer listening within a sound, within an interior now avoided, within an interior for now forgotten. The wave crashed, the curl ripped, the rip had it, having had it, with breath following breath, with breath hocketing breath, Audience and musician encounter one another as counterbalanced, airily unvoiced instruments. 2 breaths vectored, 2 breaths insensate, 2 breaths just sliding past, 2 breaths shaped and detached, 2 breaths set on glide, the both unaware, 2 breaths exiting opposite, and neither moves the other. Merely chords and divisions, stacking and balancing multiples on multiples within multiples, crossing division, no breath-stilling chord, no chord-stilling breath, the fill before the expand, before the just sliding by, ignorant by design, no breath stilling another, hexed human chords sensing, blackly picturing, shaping each breath, hexed chords coordinated just O, and the mirrored breaths rushing past one by one to disappear soundless, stage right, stage left. Specters, no breath and no memory, let's do it again. Instead, you could choose to picture the musician's 2 hands firmly grasping, the unseen instrument concealed within praying hands, 2 hands pressed together with fingers fanned as widely as possible, or with fingers interlocked, squeezing out a broadly irregular pulse. The soloist threatens to multiply, at first as softly and then more softly than possible, to produce no sound and to provoke none. Grappler, what kind of oath is that? To provoke none. Begin by removing the instrument from its case, a modest soul simply coffined. The mystery previously from behind the door climaxes with the musicians out of the blue, comic theatrical stumble, sudden lunge into an unnecessary dusting, a forceful exclamatory exhale, breath striking solid with no visible result. A skeleton fingernail key insertion into and brief suspenseful wriggle in the case's oversized lock. 4 clicks of the latches, and it's a brief matter of time upon us, breathes the audience. Then an awful, clattering shake and spills forth, disassembled, manifold, truly unrecognizable as instrument. A dirty heap dominating the stage, dumped inconclusively out. The musician pauses to consider the heap of parts. She looks every bit as surprised as the audience, every bit as disappointed, every bit as perplexed. Where to begin to construct the instrument? Witnesses to a countdown, 1 sound and 1 sound less. Musician, audience, heap. How did the performance begin? The inspection and sounding of parts, the selection of parts, the sorting and categorizing of parts that might form an instrument, the task of sounding parts individually, parts representing any number of potential instruments to emerge from, to be assembled from the heap. For more than a few observers, the process seemed to begin with the least urgency, perhaps the least physical effort, and it should be said not without provocation. In the absence of mind's eye, touch. In the absence of mind's eye, breath striking. In the absence of scale, degree, even of continuum, the performance initially impresses as little apart from pauses, hesitant touches, and nearly soundless breaths. The musician walks lightly atop the heap of parts, lest it should shift and she damage the instrument or herself be injured. She steps cautiously and comes to a halt only with exquisite care. Beware the landslide or cratering or onstage avalanche. With a tenuous footing, with a nervous footprinting, she bends down to select from amidst this filthy, rusted glacier of cast-off, decidedly used and reused parts, a promising pebble covered in cellophane. Before a marveling audience, she unwraps a piece of white, semi-translucent candy, pops it into her mouth. One part less, one part vanished, just like that. The musician has ingested a piece of hard candy instrument and chomped it to nothing in half a dozen loudly cracking bites. One part less, and she stows the cellophane, the audience's favorite instrument, in her back pocket. The heap appears to all eyes perfectly undiminished. This could take some time. The musician thoughtfully paces. The audience instinctively straightens. The musician bends at the waist, shakes her head, resumes her slow steps. She sifts through the rubble with her feet, from time to time squatting or kneeling down to select from among a handful of detritus. To sift, to let fall, and occasionally to sound the individual piece, whether by striking, squeezing, blowing, rubbing, chewing, or swallowing. Footsteps through the filthy snowdrift of parts threaten to establish a rhythm. A slow march, a frozen march, an icebreaker. Surely the instrument need not be so complex. Of how many pieces is it comprised? Must it be so precious, so artfully scavenged a thing? She could be searching for a few well-sifted, wisely chosen handfuls. She could be searching for who knows what length of time. This looks to be a solo performance. How precise and how extensive an instrument can this one musician assemble in the time that's upon us? To manipulate, to learn to manipulate, to her satisfaction, to whose? What effect do we, the audience, have on the unfolding of the performance? On its scale, given the tempo of this, our exhale, given the volume of raw material with which we're confronted, with which the musician is confronted, the overwhelming volume of material, to all eyes, the undiminishing pile. What compels the bowerbird? The audience sinks deeper into its seats. We may be hard to read out here in the darkness, but we're not without concern. The musician's pacing slowly begins to reshape the heap, to sculpt with her feet the spill, that echoed from the starting gun, the glacier of roasted fishes and loaves. But once there was a door, and you'll likely recall more simple times before the performance began. It will be a miracle if anything of use can be retrieved from this heap. If it's not wrapped, don't even consider eating it. Yet the musician keeps truffling these blue, thankfully wrapped candies, popping them in her mouth. She absent-mindedly grazes on them, these trompe l'oeil chunks of ice fished out of a tetanus-blooming glacier, chomping unaware. Her focus centers on the act of scavenging and the promise of realizing an instrument. Her patient, distracted steps and her at times calf or knee-deep wading gradually recognizes the heap into a system of ridges and paths. One can foresee the musician sinking herself into a system of canals and lunar lanes, of shoulder-height sheer faces, of paths between piles, landscape. The most helpful member of the audience suddenly locks on the presence of a partially disinterred music stand and springs from his seat to dig and to separate the stand from heap, in his own fashion altering the spilled, disassembled, unedited instrument. After the stand is placed just so, the flag marking the moon of Iwo Jima to his improvised specifications, he He turns to the musician and impatiently gestures with, for all to see, 3 taps on an imaginary wristwatch. Shall we start? Don't try to tell me that this began who knows when. Don't snow me, don't snow us all gathered, such as we are, with performance immemorial, with the intermittence of listening, an accelerated pantomime of a snore and jerking awake. Time was when? Was upon whom? The musician gapes, blinks theatrically, snow blindsided. The helpful audience member positions himself down lighted rectangle left, in one of the heap's more prominent canals, and to the surprise of all present, he indicates with a cocky hitchhiker's thumb a scavenged, worse-for-wear copy of a score. This should solve any questions that might arise. The self-appointed volunteer from the audience has done his yeoman's best to smooth out the crumpled score, to make it readable to the musician and presentable to the audience. He stands knee-deep in trash, eager to assume page-turning duties. 3 more taps, this time upon the stained front cover of the score. Ready now. He flashes a lottery winner's smile to the audience, lets it just as quickly evaporate, and pivots back to the musician with a mask of determination. The 2 figures symmetrically lean in toward the score and share a squint. The audience faintly purrs. We drink up the duo's silent, synchronized eye movements, their careful parsing of the ragged score. 2 audience members in the back row take this opportunity to turn, lock eyes, and soundlessly touch glasses of red wine, a toast to one another, a toast to the connoisseurship that muffles the room. A flash goes off to capture and commemorate the alliance of musician and page-turner, and the photographer is immediately set upon by a small mob of neighboring audience members who quietly and thus more sternly reprimand him with words, gestures, eyebrows. No more photography, no more interruptions. When the 2 figures finally complete their businesslike reading of the score, mutual nods, snaps of the neck. The page-turner visibly relaxes, resets for the counting in, a meaningful pause at 0 time, and with 2 hands interlocked and 8 fingers interlaced, and ramping up to the maximum pressure that she can exert in an attempt to pulverize between hard, dry palms another rusted treasure plucked from the heap, the musician neglects, to the clear disappointment of the helpful audience member, the first and most basic instruction in the score. Don't improvise. Too late. The page-turner winces, and his frustration and perplexity ripple through the audience. The score is clear on this point. Begin by composing a gesture, just one. Compose and prepare a single musical gesture that can be repeated. Compose yourself, it's understood. Don't start by fishing for the novel implement, the rarest of pieces selected from the heap. Don't start with the disassemblage. 0 time means start time. The beginning, not prior to, not starting with the most preliminary, most tentative searching and sifting, not hashing it out in public, not so-called real-time research. Give us a downbeat. Count us in, but not in the absence of an instrument. Don't start by hoping against hope that an instrument suggests itself. Don't imagine that an instrument emerges from the mud, from the glacier, will evolve in our presence, will evolve on our overnight watch, will make the gaspingly painful historic transition from primordial sea to lighted rectangle. Did you see that in the score? I'm turning the page here. Let's stick with page 1. Compose a single gesture. Any instrument may be used, as long as the instrument allows you to repeat the gesture. Repeat. The musician on the heap, the pitcher on the mound, shakes it off. She stubbornly refuses signal after signal, from the page turner. Compose your gesture. Make certain that it can be repeated. With what? The lighted rectangle contains a sodden spill of a miraculous volume, a biblical multiplication outward from a point source, a spill like the propagation of sound, a spill, a wave crashed, a junk heap veined blue, a glacier that in the presence of an audience is gradually being transformed into ridges, paths, canals, avenues. One can view the heap itself as a single instrument, but one can also envision a nearly limitless number of instruments, of combinations, of permutations to be excavated from the landscape. Flowering families sculpted from the landscape, score and page turner be damned, the musician remains intent on prospecting, on sifting, sorting, and sounding one piece at a time, on publicly auditioning fragments from an as yet undiscovered instrument, as yet unrecognizable instrument. Make certain that this gesture can be repeated for what passes as exact. The musician defaults to no expression, resumes her work, faces away from the page. Turner appears intensely interested in something that looks like a shattered, weaponized, shiv-like fragment of a video cassette. Dusts it with her sleeve, spit shines, and carefully places in a back pocket, perhaps for later. The page turner ignores this and similar provocations. Furthermore, thrice finger points the page turner. Don't start improvising the very means of sound production when the score clearly demands an integral instrument. Do your homework. Arrive prepared and ready. To play. It's implied by the fact of the score, no matter its holding the deteriorating object at arm's length, no matter its condition. Legibility, not the issue. Does it need to say know your instrument? Know the contours of, know the boundaries of, know the capabilities of producing sound, of producing a sound, a gesture, one that can be repeated, and know it before the first audience member arrives. For this piece, you need only know a single gesture, a single replicable gesture, no real simplicity, shaker carpentry, chairs on pegs. Simple like a downbeat. So why this disarticulated heap of pebbles, stones, dirt, mud, ice, wrapped candies that I wouldn't dare put in my own mouth, ball bearings, cassette 8-track, beta VHS tape, empty soda bottles, unopened soda bottles, ladies' shoes, men's shoes, magazines and newspapers from who knows when, kids' shoes, baby shoes, windshields, windshield wipers, sorry no windshield wiper fluid, lovely memories of Maxwell Street Market in its prime. And the makings and unmakings of car batteries. What's the proper way to display a score? Grab yourself a shovel and help me dig. This is what we're talking about. A more conventionally musical strata, maybe the rumored mother lode, a principal vein of beginner-sized violins, bridges, serious uncoils of strings, stacks of hymnals, recorders, school band instruments in their unbreakable cases, the makings of a drum line, an odd calophone, a grand piano's heart, various demolished frames and skeletons from coordinating structures. All that remains is to choose pathways, holes awaiting your breath, a volume of air so easily disturbed. How long this search, how long since the performance began? since before zero time, since before the first seat was filled, breath and breath exiting opposite, how long since beginning the quietly sounded labor of publicly assembling the cast-off parts, since first ingesting a coruscating polar bear candy, while balanced atop this glacier of thrashed parts, the music stand and tattered score spiked flag-like into the heat, and the page turner remains very much at the ready, resets for the counting down. A piece secreted, something squirreled in a pocket, defiance. Toss it unsorted, pitch it unfiled. Inscrutable criteria of selection, it drifts within the pile. Inscrutable multiplication of categories of flowering phyla among the paths, piles of gray streak, black streak, above all active volcanic landscape, a stage upon which the lighted rectangle, the visible boundary, within which the patient inspection of what might contribute to form an instrument. One half of the audience is unable to banish the thought. Each piece slowly, quietly retreat from the heat, is smaller than the previous one. The previous one less, and these diminishing shiftings in stone, metal, and crumb sound the assembling and someday sound the assemblage. The slightest pressure to produce no sound. Sublime touch, or the strongest force to produce no sound. Stranglehold. Someday. But first, these individual pieces, no matter what the score might say, the other half of the audience is that much closer to sleep. To sound or not sound, to sleep, to stir or its opposite, the gradually narcotized, assembled. The musician takes her time, constructs a performance of delays, or, as per the page turner, delays the start of the performance with ever-lengthening intervals, tied-up rests, the aperiodic, syrupier downshifts in density, in counterpoise to the ever-smaller parts that are dug out. Of the heat. It seems that way to half the audience, to sleep from the sound. Before sounding, the pressure brought to bear on the dolefully choked, uncrushable instrument. One part of it and one part less. The mineral's deposition. To sound the individual piece, hidden between two interlocked hands, between how many more interlaced fingers, and then the hands unclasped and the fingers fanned broadly. The individual piece was merely appealing, a carving, a fleck, and where did it go? The barely visible divot, the fleshy cord hesitating on the threshold of faith. And did the audience nod and nod off in unison? It vanished. One half, the sound of the vanishing threshold, sensed immediately by performer, page turner, and the half of the audience that's still awake. These individuals can't make themselves comfortable. They're disturbed by the slower unison breathing of the sleepers. They're distressed for wondering whether the performance has started yet. We're ready, we're asleep already. When the performer unexpectedly signals that she's completed her research and makes ready to assemble the unimagined instrument. Two shades of snore, push-pull, seesaw. The fight aspect is finished. One round and actually considerably less. Less, not a full round. take the oath and provoke none, with the exception of the page turner. These countless pebbles and crumbs and the stray tooth, the inedible heap from which the instrument is assembled, the heap shrinks, the instrument grows. Regardless, to sound as clearly as possible, excite a fleshy chord in aperture, a cross aperture, and applying the minimum possible force, metal wheel rounding metal rail, a slow upturn bend, a rising piercing metal obscured by the minimum possible flutter.